Dun, dun, dun. Hello, everyone. Good morning. How you feeling? Let's hear it. Round of applause for you, the fact that you got up this morning. Woo! I'm really pleased to be here, and I hope your head doesn't hurt too much. I'm here today to talk to you about experimental game design and specifically some of my perspective on what we should do with games moving forward and some of the issues that I feel like games can address, not just creatively, but also technologically. Thinking about like a 5-year timeline for what game design can be in the future. 5 years isn't really that long in video games. If you work on video games, it's about one video game long, maybe most of one game long. So I think it's really risky to think more than 5 years out, but I'm always thinking about the future because I'm fairly future-oriented. And as a way of sort of introducing myself and talking about that a bit, I'm just going to run through some background. Before I do, how many of you were here when I was here last month at the Nordic Game Jam and saw my talk there? Okay, and how many of you saw me speak at Reboot? Okay, great. So there's a little bit of stuff in here from both of those talks, but it's not all the same. So I, am a game designer and a CEO. I run a business in San Francisco, and GDC happens in San Francisco every year. I've been on the road for a long time. This year I was at PAX, and before that I was at DICE, and then I came here, and then I went to Japan for BitSummit, and then I came back. I've been all over the world the last 6 months or so, thinking about game design and talking with a lot of game designers. When Chris Crawford founded GDC in 1988, there were 27 people in his living room, and this past year there were a lot more people than that. So when I started going, I was a graduate student, and then this past year I hosted the GDC Awards. So my life has really changed over the course of that period of time, thinking about playing games to making games and then participating in the community. My background is in robotics, so I used to do robotics and AI as a researcher in graduate school. And then I wrote a paper about mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, which became one of the most cited works on game design in the sort of game design nerd community, academia-wise. And really, the focus of all of the work that I did was on thinking about how to integrate learning and classroom experiences and thinking about adjustment and difficulty in games, as well as thinking about simulation and systems for making games more more immersive, more interactive, and thinking about storytelling as well. So my graduate work was in dynamic difficulty. I became really interested in the idea of education in games, and I actually worked on the GDC Education Summits, which have been going for about 20 years now. I also helped found the concept of game jams. So I was the first female game jammer on the planet Earth. This is a photo of me doing some hardcore haxering with my friend Sean Barrett. A lot of the people that helped found the first Indie Game Jam are now pretty senior in games. It includes John Blow, Chris Hecker, Ottman Binstock, who's the chief research scientist at Oculus, Brian Sharp, who's also at Facebook Oculus and has made Medium, which is a fantastic piece of software. And at the time that we made game jams, we wanted to think about like what would it be like if you made weird games and then put them up on the internet for free. So that was a long time ago. It was before there was any such thing as distribution systems for video games. And then what we did was we decided we would get together at GDC and show these weird games to other people. So we started the Experimental Gameplay Workshop. I've been running that showcase now for 16 years. And this year we had over 250 entries for 15 slots. So in many ways, experimental gameplay is harder to get into than the IGF, which is kind of insane. I work really hard on advocacy and new voices, trying to create experiences where people can get together and talk about making games who come from different communities and maybe communities that are underrepresented. In specific, I've been working for a long time with the IGDA and also the Global Game Jam to continue to promote the idea that games can be made all over the world by all different kinds of people. And in the last 20 years since I started working on games, the world has really changed. It's amazing if you think about it, the difference between 20 years ago and now in terms of game technologies and access and the kinds of people that can make games, but also the kinds of people that can access your games and play them on the internet, right? Or on their phone. When I started making video games, you had to know someone who knew someone who knew someone who could put your game on a disc and get it in a store. It was a huge amount of barrier to entry. And that's completely changed. How many of you, by show of hands, have bought a game on a digital store in the last month? How many of you have bought a game in a physical store in the last month? Yeah, it was exactly the opposite when I started. So a lot has changed since I first started making video games. And more, I think that what's so interesting about the next 5 years is that in addition to everyone being able to purchase digital games, people are able to make games and put them out there for free just to see what happens. I teach at UC Santa Cruz, and instead of doing this now, I encourage students to do this. You know, to make a game that is different, that really questions what the mechanics of games can be, and engages people in a new way. I think when you do that, you get groundbreaking success, you get awards, you get all kinds of recognition, but you also open the landscape of games for new people, and you give people the idea to try new things, which is so fantastic, right? This is a very, very strong power that all video game designers, creators, developers, publishers have, is the ability to inspire people to try new things. So after shipping Journey, I founded Funomena, which is we've been around for about 5 years now in San Francisco. We're almost like 25 people now, growing, hiring. I wanted to work at the intersection of games and experimentation and hardware. And I really wanted to think about games as a valuable part of an ecosystem for any new technology, because I think that now, more than ever, people need games on new platforms to get people to pay attention to them. So I wanted to build a business that focused on that and specifically focused on innovative ways to engage new technologies. So for example, if you don't already know, we work on VR and AR stuff. We do a lot of mixed reality work as well. Luna, which was nominated for the IGF this year for visual excellence, and just recently actually for 4 more awards at the Brazil Indie Games Festival, is an experiential creation and storytelling tool, kind of toy in VR, and we're really, really thrilled to have released that with several partners, including Microsoft Mixed Reality, Oculus, Intel, and Facebook. And then, of course, Watam, which we'll be releasing this fall, as graced the cover of Edge magazine in February. They were actually very kind and included a 5-page spread on Funomena in the December Mario issue, just all about me, which was really fantastic. But one of the things that's so great about this particular cover is that it really focuses on what Funomena is about, right? Which is like this idea of independent games and changing the world, right? Now that's something that people say, like changing the world. Like, I'm going to make technology that changes the world, and then they make Twitter. And that's not necessarily great. But I feel like what is so powerful and so interesting as a developer is that you can really ask hard questions with games, and you can change the way people think about the world through the games that you make. So a lot of people see games in a certain light, and I know you don't. And I think that your contribution can be very valuable in helping change the way people see games. They're not necessarily about the memes that we've been using to advertise games for a very long time. They're increasingly about experiences and embodiment and being able to see the world through a lens and thinking about systems and design and the way that they interface with us and then the way that we interface with each other. I think games are increasingly social. They're increasingly technologically advanced, and specifically, they're engaging us more and more in an opportunity to think about rules and systems and dynamics and how we can live better together on the planet. And I know that sounds a little bit highfalutin, but it's true that in order to stay alive on this planet, humans will have to link arms and work together to deal with some of the changes that we're facing. I believe that if you think of games in the way that the Bauhaus thought of material, that you can see their outcomes as a natural part of a process, and that experimental game design and rapid prototyping and game jamming are tools of a craft that can be used to explore new systems and change the way you think about difficult problems, but then the way the players think about difficult problems. So what are difficult problems? I'm a game designer, so my idea of what's interesting or juicy might be different from you. But I'm really interested in the idea that games can confront systems of representation and relation, and perhaps help us confront and undo unconscious bias and the systems that nationalism and unconscious bias create, systems of oppression, war, and violence in our society. I'm extremely interested in the idea that games can actively portray the emotional labor and the tax that sexism and gender-based thinking place on women and queer folks and trans folks. I think that they can also begin to test designs for systems of safety that work better than the whisper networks that we have currently to keep ourselves safe in communities where we are oppressed. I think that games can look at systems of voting and governance and civic engagement and think about how we communicate across societies, acting as living brainstorms or simulations of new ways of mass participation in governance, even when they're not explicitly political. You know, a game doesn't have to be explicitly political in order to approach these kinds of topics. It just needs to make you think twice about how you value your choices versus someone else's choices, or how you distribute, say, something like wealth. Money and finance and the way that these systems work can be explored in games, again, not explicitly, but implicitly in the systems that we design, just as we might explore such things in a science fiction novel. Like, what are we doing right now, or what might we do, to distribute wealth in a more fair and equitable manner locally and globally? Like, what would a game that was really about Bitcoin be like? What would a game that was really about stamp-backed currency or negative interest be like? These are some interesting ideas. Even things like food waste and food sustainability, land use. These are all really interesting topics for games that ask us difficult questions and maybe even help educate populations who don't necessarily understand how their own eating choices affect the ability of others to have a same level of nourishment, right? Not all countries suffer from the rampant homelessness that we see in my hometown of San Francisco, but we might need to think about things like pop-up housing and migrant communities and the ways that we cultivate a more sustainable living society in the force of radical climate change and weather events. Games and systems that games make can explore these kinds of ideas, again, not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly. What other issues related to the Anthropocene, the era of man on Earth, might we explore with our games, and how would we do it? How would, say, a quick, simple sketch made by a game designer allow an economist or a scholar or a politician to think through and then take action before it's too late? You know, looking at these problems with games might not seem ideal. It certainly wouldn't solve the problems on their own. But I think that it's interesting to inspire people to dream of different solutions or spark conversations around these issues by exploring them with our systems. And I think it's a very powerful tool that we have almost exclusive access to currently. And the reason that I think that you can make a difference by doing this is because that I have. In just, you know, the short period of slides that I showed you, I've concretely and measurably impacted the practice of making games through game jams, education for games. I've built my own education program. I've actually built my own business as well, and my business is focused on diverse and equitable hiring and also building games that are about these problems, right? So, you know, if I can do it, I'm just like one old lady. You know, you can do it. You're very young. I can see you out there, young, vigorous Nordic gamers. You can really make a difference. And so, you know, if games can change as quickly in the 20 years that I've been participating in it, and have gotten old and wrinkly and sad now, then they can change that quickly, or maybe even more so in the next 20 years. And that's kind of really interesting to me. I had been reading this book the last time that I was here, which is about potential futures that might exist based on an assumption. The assumption is that we assume automation becomes a thing and that we can fab anything we want. And we also assume that there will be significant climate change. And then you look at continuums of scarcity and abundance, hierarchical and non-hierarchical rule. And the book posits that there are 4 possible futures. It explores the idea of a society where things are essentially completely abundant and people can basically live their best lives and do what they want, where climate change does lead to some significant scarcity, so we have to work together to survive. A future where the few people that own the IP that we use to fab most everyday objects control the lives of the many, or one in which military force determines basically population control. And the book is a fantastic read. It's quite short. But what struck me about the book, and what I was talking about when I was here last month, is the idea that there's this idea that it's much more interesting to explore the possibilities for futures, likelihoods, rather than likelihoods, because a great more many things might happen than actually do. So rather than sort of saying, well, it's likely that sexism, racism, and climate change will continue until we live in Blade Runner, 2, maybe we could imagine something else. And I think actually Angie yesterday sort of started talking about this a little bit and thinking about building a game like Horizon versus a game like Killzone, right? Specifically, this idea that there is an importance of assessing the possibility rather than the likelihood, and that it puts our collective action at the center while making a confident prediction about what will happen will only encourage passivity. Because I do teach and I do interact with students on a daily basis, and particularly artists who are very sensitive and are very aware of the context that we're in right now, there has to be a way for me to engage them positively and to motivate them to continue making games, right? To continue making art, to continue living and not just, be done with it. Going beyond that, this notion that by simulating a future through a system like a game design, we could do it in our mind or in a book, but when we do it with a game, I feel like we can perhaps create an even more powerful version of what he calls in this book a self-preventing prophecy, a tale that helps us avoid a specific future, or even better, imagine, alternative likelihoods to the post-apocalyptic future that we see in so many films and games now. I think that that's really powerful stuff. I think it's a really strong tool, and that as designers, we can use this tool to communicate and change and make a difference. And like I said, I believe that games like Horizon, or what Patrice is building, his new game, which we talked about a little bit at Reboot, like these types of titles allow us to imagine either a different past or a different future, to imagine ourselves differently, and hopefully having more agency than we might feel we do right now, especially in the kind of news cycle and the climate of internet information. So, I didn't come here to tell you to make games for change. Like, that's not why I'm up here. I'm here to talk about what I think the next 5 years could look like. But I wanted to set up a context for why I'm here, in the sense that, I didn't just come here to, blah, blah, blah about video games. I can do that at home in San Francisco. Half of my friends from San Francisco are at these conferences, and I don't need to travel to do it. The reason I do it is because I'm hoping that someone out there has the potential to have an idea that really does change things for the better. I don't know that I do. I mean, I'm trying my best, but again, I'm old and my brain is almost dried up. Have pity on me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think are really fascinating for the next 5 years, right? That if you take the first chunk of the talk, which is just like context, like making games in the Anthropocene, what do I think is interesting? So I'm really fascinated by the idea of post-fidelity development. When you look at games today, it is clear that we can do fidelity. You can have great chrome, beautiful grass, explosions, light fog, depth of field, color correction, level of detail management in real time on huge maps, so long as you can get the time to get it all done, right? And there are a lot of interesting technical problems to solve in games, not just in graphics, but when you look at a game like Dreams, it's amazing what you can do if you just kind of take an orthogonal approach to the way that games are rendered and built. But we've moved beyond basic pathfinding. A lot of the stuff that was really difficult to do when I was a graduate student in AI in the early 90s and 2000s is just solved. March 14th, 2001, it's done. And some of the other stuff that I studied in graduate school, like dynamic difficulty adjustment and level design, specifically using tools with dynamic difficulty adjustment, is at play in major game development teams already, as we also heard yesterday, because it's often used as a cost-saving measure to help sketch out worlds and save labor. Not that many posts on this comment. I think that one of the things that's interesting is that there's so many robots now generating news and information, and then the idea of also robots generating levels, it starts to become kind of scary to think about us being replaced by machines. But in writing this talk, and I put insert game about, joke about robots building our games for us here, that robots can't build our games for us, right? For a variety of reasons. We have to ask ourselves, what do we really want from our machines and what do we really want from our experiences? There is so much stuff that we can still do. I was on a panel at GDC this year with a bunch of other very smart people talking about what could we ask for. I really think it would be nice if we built games that paid attention, not just that they fulfill the contract between me and the game by having a companion character next to me going, way to go, awesome, you blew that guy's head right off. That's okay. But what if they really paid attention? So my friend Laura Lynn McAdams was on this panel, and she was like, I play this game, and in the game there are these enemies, and the enemies are these creepy spider creatures. And every single time one of the creepy spider creatures comes out from wherever, I freak out, and I start tripping over myself. I'm dropping my stuff, I'm very wigged out by the spider guys. The other baddies I don't really have a problem with, but the spider guys I always have a problem with. My sidekick should notice this. And it could either tease me about it, or it could give me emotional support. Or the game could maybe tune them down a little bit so I start to feel a little bit more confident when I kill them. That's just a basic way of paying attention, right? Not just, oh boy, you killed it, but wow, those spiders sure are scary. Let's get those guys. When you have a character that can show responsive emotions, in addition to paying attention to you, then suddenly you have an experience where not only are you building a bond with the sidekick, but also perhaps over time, the game is trying to help you understand the environment through what it says, but also that character starts to reflect change and become something that you really care about and develop a relationship with. We talk about this all the time in game design, but we very rarely do it. We very rarely focus on characters that pay attention and then respond. And specifically, I think we don't build characters that are interesting. When you look at a book and you look at a film, or you say look at Game of Thrones, what makes the characters in those stories interesting? It's that they're fucked up. They're not okay. How many movies do you go watch about just everyone's, going to work, not hungover, not having affairs, not driving drunk and having car accidents, not losing all their money gambling. This is the whole point, right? We talk about the disasters. We talk about what's not working out because it helps us understand our lives. Like Oedipus, that's a messed up story. That's one of the earliest, just the Bible is filled with messed up stories. This is what we do. And yet when we make characters in games, they're just like, oh boy, you sure shot that guy in the head. That's uninteresting to me at all. And I think that we can talk about it, but specifically, I think what it means is being predictably broken. Just a broken character who just does the wrong thing all the time and is mean or weird or whatever, that's the QWOP of AI-based character games. It's just a character that does random stuff all the time. You could do that, but looking at a character that you spend time with in a game, or some characters that you spend time with in a game, who are predictably broken and responsive, they're biased, their attitude towards you is biased, but not so biased that you can't understand them, right? I think one of the hardest things about making other characters interesting is having the subtlety of action, the responsiveness and the paying attention stuff, and requiring the player to read their actions and their intentions and predict based on their behaviors, right? Like it's like if you could improv with a game character, what would that look like? The last time that a game tried to do this was a really long time ago. Michael is a colleague of mine at UC Santa Cruz. Like, this is his thesis work. Like, he's a wrinkled up old man, just like I'm a wrinkled up old lady with a shriveled up brain. We can't solve this problem now. Like, you guys have to solve it. And I want to retire and play these games, so this is the other reason why I'm up here. But it's really interesting. Like, when was the last time you played a game that really tried to make you feel like you were interacting with a character and you were trying to predict their behavior in the same way that you might on a first date? Or when you're walking up to someone at a bar and trying to figure out if you can get to a first date. I think if you note that the work in this area, is being done mostly in graduate schools and on research campuses of major labs, what you end up looking at in the space when you start to kind of dig into it is this idea of fidelity versus dynamism. What we have achieved in fidelity, I think, is sort of realism in games, is that we have built a lot of games with spaces that feel natural. They have a pleasing density, but they're not real, because if they were real, they would take too long to build. Like if you could zoom into the tree, and then zoom into the moss, and then zoom into the insects on the moss, and then zoom into the, and that's everything, right? Like that's David's game. But like it's extremely abstract, right? You can't really do that yet. So we don't want to overload the space with too much activity or visual clutter, but we don't want it to be too thin, because then it feels fake, right? Like if you walk through a level of No Man's Sky, it just starts to feel really thin, because it's not a pleasing density. It's dense, but it's not pleasing. So really high fidelity systems that work have this fidelity, and they have the appropriate responses from characters. So I'm not saying that they're interesting like I was talking about before, but we have characters that'll walk around with you and say like, hey, we need to go over here and do this, or hey, blah, 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 blah. They're appropriate. They're not awesome, but they're appropriate. Aww. I love the sound of babies. It's like instant human connection. A baby is upset. So how do we really do this? I think we do it by simulating the world and the character behavior with physics and supplementing that with animation. And then use script story beats and emotional responses to that space. And this is true whether it's a linear game or an open world game where you have a map with hotspots. And what ends up happening is this ends up scripting player choice. The things that the player can do become constrained naturally by this kind of design. So we focus on creating contiguous, realistic world maps, and then it requires that we gate the choices in order to focus people on the right place at the right emotional moment, which, when we run into production deadlines, we know how this gets. Like, we cut stuff out. And it's like, you were way over here on this side of the map, and suddenly you're over here. You got a new dirigible, and now you're on the other side of the map, hanging out with this other clan or whatever. Like, this is what happens. We overscope, and then we cut. And what we end up with is like this kind of like somewhat fidelity, but it's sad. Or we create highly connected maps, this idea of the open world, and then we lean on the players to do all the choosing and the directing of the experience, where we have like a hot area and a cool area, and like you can go do this and you can go do this, and we give you the option of moving around, but we're really letting you dictate the dynamism in the system. So there's really not a lot there, and from a game design perspective, we're leaning very hard on the player. By contrast, I would like to say that what you see with something like The Sims or Spore, it is entirely different, right? It's aliveness. And when we try to push for dynamism, I think what we end up creating is spaces that are changing or living. Not because they're faking something real, but because they're working to provide the player with a pleasing density of choice or action of information at the same time that they're also trying to inform their own behavior. So they add a step. They suddenly become responsible for that curation themselves. And I think that's the thing. Curation is the word, I think, to think about. And what that does to players, when you really build a beautiful dynamic system that players can interact with, is it tickles your brain. It makes you want to learn. And if anyone in this room is interested in education and how games like, can turn everybody into, geniuses in the metaverse who can, do math with their mind's eye and all this stuff, right? Like the future of education is always said to be interactive systems, Diamond Age style, ladies primer. This is the kind of design you have to do that. And it's really hard. And it's especially hard to do just as research. You have to build the whole system out. Game designers, games do this. We just do it in very, very small, discrete chunks. I think it's safe to say that many high-fidelity games who have leaned into dynamism, like, for example, Fortnite or PUBG, or even something like a LOL, are getting away with putting almost all the onus on the players. But I think the ones that are truly experimental do this with systems. And I just couldn't resist putting this picture in my deck because it's a Sims game in which the Sim is playing with figures of my Sims, which is my first game design ever. It's just like weird. I worked on the Sims and then I made this chibi-style Sims game, and now they've put all the characters back into the Sims. It's like mind blown, cosmic brain. But games like this really do something different. And I think there's a huge potential for games in the next 5 years to start doing this. In those games, like Sims or 1 Hour, 1 Life, which Jason just recently released, we see the simplification of space, graphically and in terms of systems, like physics, but a focus on the systems of actions between the actors and the outcome of those responses in the simulation space itself. Again, curating the experience for the player. In a way, it actually has the opposite effect on player choice because the state space of possible play patterns is huge. So instead of having this, you get this. You can create systems where a single choice blossoms out into a whole kind of gameplay experience, or where decisions that you make as you walk through the gameplay experience weight and then therefore influence future opportunities in that space. And I believe that you can do this with machines, with single and multiplayer experiences now in a way that you just couldn't do it 20 years ago. This is what's now, in my opinion. I will admit that from a branding perspective, we have done a terrible job of selling dynamism to players. We're really good at saying, go online and dress up in a costume and shoot other people. And we're very bad at design the entire universe from start to finish, right? Like that's just like, it's just a hard player fantasy anyway. Like Spore has all kinds of problems, but look at the art, man. Like we're not really trying to get at dynamism with player fantasies in the same way that we have with this idea of fidelity and action and execution and winning, right? And I think that that's a problem. I also think there's a whole talk just in this slide. But it's a marketing talk, and I am not smart enough to give a good marketing talk, so I'm not going to give it. I'm just going to stick to game design for dummies. But I do think that there's room to explore player types and ways of engaging players, like The Sims has, that really do address wider swaths of the market. Like, let's just look at Fortnite compared to PUBG, right? There's this idea that in Fortnite you can do side quests. You don't have to be excellent at achieving in that game in order to hang out with your friends and play it. It's very friendly. Like my niece and her girlfriend and a bunch of us were just hanging out the other day playing Fortnite and just swapping the controller around and doing this and that and the other. It's fun to try it, and you don't have to be great at it to have an interesting conversation about it. So it starts to build in some player dynamics, even on the couch, right? I think it's really interesting to build worlds that appeal to players that try to get at all four quads of the graph, the Bartle sort of graph. I also think that when you combine the tech that we're seeing now with these systems, you get really interesting things. Like this is Petri's new game, Noita, where every single pixel in the game is simulated. Like, so you can do lava that falls out that sets everything on fire, that literally burns the whole map to the ground. I mean, it's amazing. It's really interesting work. Very difficult to do mathematically, but he's figured it out now. Or if you look at what Christina Ann Coffin is doing, working on rendering and simulation, the possibilities in the space for like dynamic flowing changing graphics that respond in the same way that the systems underneath it respond is really interesting. It's really interesting to think about collecting observations about the player in order to create context that influences the behavior of the world and then give graphic feedback that shows that context changing, enriching, enhancing, shaping the space based on the choices that the player makes. And I used to always focus on MDA when I would give these talks, but it's actually become very commonplace for designers to think about the aesthetic outcome that they want to achieve and then work backwards to the rules. So instead, I'd like to talk a little bit about this slide from Chris Crawford. How many of you actually have an awareness of Chris Crawford's game design work or the kinds of things that he's built as a game designer? Okay, so he's a really revolutionary game designer in the early 80s, and he built a lot of interesting systems. And this is from a book that he wrote called The Art of Computer Game Design. I have like a very rare printed copy of this book with actual color illustrations. And what he says here is, some media are dynamic. They show change with time. Movies, music, and dance are dynamic in this way. They are able to represent the changing aspect of reality more richly. But the most fascinating thing about reality is not that it is, or even that it changes, but how it changes. The intricate webwork and cause and effect by which all things are tied together. The only way to properly represent this webwork is to allow the audience to explore its nooks and crannies, to let them generate causes and observe effects. Thus, the highest and most complete form of representation is interactive representation. Games provide this interactive element, and it is a crucial factor in their appeal. Okay, he wrote this in like 1984. It's still true, and yet we're not doing it. We're so far down the road of like rendering the buttons on the jacket of the guy that you are shooting to loot. And we are calculating the bullets on a server in real time in the cloud and paying so much money to do it. We've built so much stuff to build the same shooting gallery that we've been making for a very, very long time. This is really hard. He left the games industry completely and went to Oregon to live out in the middle of nowhere and do it by himself. And guess what? You can't do it by yourself. We all have to work together to solve this problem. And I actually think that what he's talking about here is the future of education. It's the future of simulation, and it's the future of us being able to have a context in which we try things out before we screw things up even worse. I just think it's so important to think about what it would be like if a game could actually react to the player's move with speed and thoroughness in the same way that you react to another person in a conversation. I'm not saying it's easy, but when you look at things through the MDA lens, I believe that what we're talking about is enabling multiple dynamics to emerge from a set of mechanics while still relating to an over-aesthetic goal. You know, the dynamics of poker, for example, are bluffing. Like, no one tells you to lie when you play poker, but you do. Why? Because you want money. Money is a thing that people play poker for, and when you play poker for nickels, you bluff less hard. Or maybe you bluff harder, who knows, depends on how rich you are. But nowhere in the rules does it say you have to do it, but everybody does. It's very interesting to think about this kind of thing now that we're building games, not only that have multiple people playing them, but that have robots curating what people see. So in PUBG, you know, you do rotations as you're playing, because as the circle closes, you want to be moving, and especially in team games, you see the dynamics emerge that people do these rotations. It's not in the rules anywhere. When a streaming service decides what the most interesting moment of gameplay is and then curates that moment to thousands of users, it starts to become game design. And we are designing games right now for streaming services that will do this. You're in the hype zone, you suddenly have 500,000 people watching you play. Like, what does that mean when you layer the hype zone on top of the rotations that emerge from a game like PUBG? Like, that's very, very interesting dynamical stuff. And I think that that's where the surface of game design is going. I do not think that it is enough anymore to be able to design a map of a series of corridors and have people run through them and shoot at stuff. That is not game design anymore. That is product design. Games are much bigger than that. And what I'm thinking about over this next year is, what do we do as bots and advertising flows continue to shape our content? How do we respond with game designs that are dynamic in the space of streaming? How do we respond with game designs that are dynamic in the face of people playing games together? When you go back to PUBG, and the audio in this game is super, super relevant. I don't really play PUBG a lot, but I have friends who do. It's really interesting to think about the spatialized audio in that game and how it impacts the way that you build a strategy for playing. It's awesome, but think about the audio in Journey. We worked so hard in that game to create a system where when you spent time with somebody, the audioscape changed and really blossomed and grew and turned into a beautiful romantic dance between you and this other person. That's just one other player. What is it like when you get a bunch of players together and then they do something really dramatic? From an artistic perspective, and perhaps even a political one, I really do think it's important to be asking hard questions about fidelity versus dynamism. And bonus, if the themes of your work reflect a strong influence in thinking about these hard problems, addressing issues of empathy and connection between people. You can build a soap opera. Like, think about Game of Thrones, right? Like sex and death, People love that shit. People love to be part of a world where all the choices have dramatic consequences. They don't even need to be shaping those choices, right? They love to just watch people turn into train wrecks and blow everything up, We can make a lot of games in this space I think are really interesting. What's so great about this is like the delicious predictability of the situation, this like fantasy you have about what you would do if you were them, and then they just go and they crater the relationship anywhere, they stick the guy in the neck, It's like you feel so, it's just like great feeling, We can make games like that. We can lean on systems of storytelling and into issues of history and lineage, where the joy is in uncovering what happened to a civilization and figuring out how they disintegrated and then how do new people live in this world, right? We already have games that are doing this. Games that look at social construction and the relationships between people, that offer fresh perspectives, like Papers, Please, or romance, or falling in love. I've given several talks about why I think this is important, but let's build some really juicy games where you're interacting with just one other person and they truly, truly fall in love with you, not just you buy them objects. So the last thing that I want to say before I wrap up is that, I believe that new technologies are the fundamental way in which we get permission to do this. Funomena has built a bunch of games. We've worked with Oculus and Intel and Google, and I'm really excited to say today that we're going to be working with Magic Leap. So we're one of the development partners for the new Magic Leap, and I can't say anything about it other than that I really believe that this idea of sort of spatial computing and the advanced light field technology that they've been talking about, state-of-art computer vision paired with this idea that you can spatialize audio and build spaces that feel so real in the real world, this is the excuse to try these new designs. It is exactly the inflection point of not doing fidelity. It's better to do dynamism and interesting systems because these things can change the world. You can just eliminate televisions once you can throw a screen up anywhere. All that waste goes away, right? It's really, really interesting time to be a game designer. And I think that there are a lot of fresh places that you can go. There's power in exploring these ideas and exploring these systems, and it's far greater than you actually realize. It's so delicious to be a game designer right now. How delicious would it be to build the first really popular game soap opera? It might even be better than a first kiss. And I think it's really easy to complain and say, we can't do this, we can't do that. Oh, you know, but it has a cord on it, or oh, you know, the batteries are going to wear out, all that stuff. Fuck that shit. Like, it's going to be awesome. Like, the future of technology is better and better and better. It's just gotten so much better in the time that I become an old lady. Like, you have no idea what it's going to be like, right? So instead of thinking about what you can't do and what we can't do as a society, think about the things that might happen. Because a lot more things might happen than actually do, and you can be the architect of that future. You can encourage passivity, or you can encourage action in the stuff that you make. You can give us the tools to think about new systems and new designs and new ways of interacting that potentially open us up to each other in new ways. And I think that's really powerful stuff. It's your power. So I don't know what's next in your 5 years. That's what I'm going to be thinking about. I'm super excited and curious to see. Obviously, I won't have time for questions, but I really do hope that you come up and talk to me about your future and tell me what you're thinking, because like I said, I'm old and my brain's all dried up. So thank you.